The air inside Fort Titan's command center was thick with the scent of cold metal and stale coffee. Rows of holographic monitors bathed the dimly lit room in shifting blue hues, casting ghostly reflections on the polished steel walls. The air vibrated with the quiet hum of machinery, interrupted only by the hushed voices of men too hardened to be shaken, yet now staring in stunned silence. General Joseph Callahan stood at the head of the war table, his hands clasped behind his back, his shoulders squared with the weight of the moment. His steel-gray eyes locked onto the largest monitor, where the live Galactic broadcast played in crisp, unforgiving detail. The insignia of the Jarvan Empire flickered, an angular crest emblazoned in deep crimson, like a wound bleeding against the darkness of space. And then the screen cut to the unimaginable. 50,000 Americans stood in silent, forced assembly upon towering platforms that stretched across an expanse of alien steel. They were men and women of every age and background, workers, soldiers, civilians, gathered like cattle beneath the shadow of execution scaffolds. Above them, in sharp contrast to the Earthborn, stood the towering figures of their Jarvan captors, their dark exoskeletal armor glinting beneath artificial suns. A voice, layered with mechanical distortion, resonated from the screen. For crimes against the sovereignty of the Jarvan Empire, these insurgents will pay the ultimate price. May their deaths serve as a lesson to those who would defy our rule. The war room was silent. Not a breath, not a movement. Callahan's grip on the chair tightened, his knuckles white. Major Adrian Jordan, standing to his right, muttered a curse under his breath, but his voice was lost in the cold vastness of space being broadcast before them. Colonel Dean Holloway exhaled slowly, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his calculating mind racing behind his unshaken facade. Captain Samuel Rivers, the youngest among them, shifted restlessly, his fists trembling at his sides. On the screen, a deep mechanical hum filled the alien arena. The air seemed to pulse as the execution platforms activated in perfect synchrony. A single red light flared, and then silence. 50,000 bodies dropped as one. A ripple of horror passed through the war room, unspoken but heavy. Even the most battle-hardened among them could not suppress the raw reaction. The tightening of jaws, the stifled breaths, the barely restrained fury simmering beneath military discipline. On the screen, the camera swept over the hanging bodies, recording the limp remains of humanity's latest massacre. It was a statement, a warning, and then the transmission cut. A deep, hollow silence filled the space where the screen had been. The monitors flickered, returning to strategic displays. But the afterimage of that scene remained burned into every mind present. Callahan turned, his voice sharp as a blade. "Holloway." The intelligence officer lifted his head, eyes shadowed. "Sir, how long until we have strike capabilities ready? We've been stockpiling for years. We can deploy within 24 hours. Callahan nodded once. He turned his gaze toward the others, his expression unreadable yet electric with purpose. Jordan, the major straightened. "Yes, sir. Begin immediate mobilization. I want every asset we have positioned for full-scale retaliation." Jordan hesitated for a fraction of a second. "General, if we move now, we'll be committing to war without any fallback. No negotiations. No exit strategy." Callahan's eyes darkened. There was no negotiation when they strung up our people like trophies. His voice remained steady, but beneath it the storm raged. "This is not a question of strategy, Major. This is the moment we stop crawling and start fighting." A beat of silence. Jordan gave a short nod, jaw set, and turned sharply, moving to relay orders. The room burst into motion. Technicians scrambled to their stations. Officers issued commands into encrypted comms, and the air of silent grief transformed into something sharper, something lethal. Rivers finally spoke, voice low with controlled fury. "Sir, permission to lead the first wave." Callahan studied him. The young captain's face was taut with barely restrained anger, the fire of vengeance gleaming in his eyes. He had lost comrades, perhaps family, to the Jarvan purges. This war was personal. Not yet, Callahan said. You'll get your shot. Rivers gave a curt nod but did not argue. Holloway leaned forward, fingers tapping against the table. The Jarvans believe they've broken us, he murmured. They think fear will keep us on our knees. They're wrong. Callahan's voice carried across the room. They want to make an example of us? Then we make an example of them. The words settled over the war room like the stillness before a storm. Every man present felt it, that shift, that weight. The Jarvan Empire had drawn their line. Earth would answer. Holloway's screen flickered, new intelligence streaming in. His expression shifted. Sir, he said carefully, eyes flicking over a classified transmission. There's more. Callahan stepped closer. What? The executions aren't over. Reports indicate they plan to exterminate another 100,000 in the next cycle. The war room froze. Jordan turned sharply. When... Holloway's voice was quiet, but his words hit like an earthquake. 72 hours. A pulse of silence. Callahan exhaled slowly. His mind was already racing, calculating, measuring every possibility. Then we move, he said. No hesitation. No mercy. The countdown had begun. Operation Cleanout was underway. Dark clouds hung low over the city of New Avalon, their heavy presence pressing down on the ruined skyline. The once proud capital of Earth might now stood as a testament to occupation, its streets patrolled by the towering Jarvan enforcers, their exoskeletal armor gleaming under the artificial glow of alien hovercrafts. The silence of submission had settled over the city like a disease, but in the shadows, something else was stirring. Inside the underground command bunker beneath Fort Titan, the War Council convened again. The dim glow of holographic war maps bathed the room in flickering light, tracing the veins of rebellion through occupied territory. General Joseph Callahan stood at the center, his presence a beacon of unyielding resolve. Around him, his closest officers waited. Major Adrian Jordan, his tactical mind sharp as a blade. Colonel Dean Holloway, his gaze always calculating, always measuring the cost of war. And Captain Samuel Rivers, his hands clenched into fists, barely containing the fury that burned in his chest. We move tonight, Callahan said, his voice steady, absolute. The Jarvans believe us crippled. That ends now. Jordan adjusted the holographic display, lines of red cutting through the map, marking enemy strongholds. Phase 1 is precision sabotage, power grids, surveillance networks, and orbital communication hubs. We strike hard and fast, make them blind before we go for the throat. Holloway's eyes flicked across the data feeds. We've identified key weaknesses. Their energy relays are centralized. One controlled detonation in New Avalon can trigger a cascading failure across their entire North American occupation. Callahan nodded. Then we take it. No mistakes. The mission fell to an elite strike team, their task clear. Infiltrate the alien-controlled power station at the heart of New Avalon and sever the Jarvan's grip on human technology. The team moved under the cover of night, weaving through the abandoned ruins where shadows stretched long and silence hung heavy. Rivers led the squad, his rifle steady, every movement precise. The weight of what they were about to do settled over them, but there was no room for hesitation. They reached the outer perimeter of the facility, its structure a grotesque fusion of human industry and alien augmentation. Jarvan sentries patrolled the entrance, their elongated forms moving with unsettling grace. Rivers signaled, and the team split into position, slipping through the gaps in security like ghosts. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of alien machinery. The station pulsed with energy, great conduits of luminescent blue running through the walls, feeding power into the Jarvan war machine. Rivers pressed forward, his breath steady, his mind razor-sharp. He reached the control hub, planning the first charge against the primary energy conduit. The second stretched long, sweat slicking the back of his neck. Then the alarm sounded. The corridors erupted in red light. the wail of an alert system splitting the silence. The Jarvans moved fast, their response immediate. The first wave of alien enforcers stormed the hallways, plasma rifles glowing with lethal promise. Rivers barely had time to shout before the firefight erupted. Gunfire cracked through the facility, the human resistance fighting with the ferocity of a species backed into a corner. Rivers moved with precision, his rifle barking as he took down the first Jarvan. The enemy was fast, but humans had always been adaptable, unpredictable. The strike team pushed forward, pressing through the corridors in a desperate fight to reach the core. Explosions rocked the facility as the charges detonated in sequence. The power conduits burst in a cascade of destruction, energy flaring wild and uncontrolled. The station trembled, its systems failing, and in the chaos, the humans slipped away, leaving the Jarvans in darkness. Back at Fort Titan, Callahan watched the city lights flicker and die. A slow smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Good," he murmured. "Let them feel what it's like to be powerless." But the war was only beginning. Holloway's intelligence network had intercepted something far more alarming. A captured Jarvan officer, battered but unbroken, sat in the reinforced cell beneath the bunker. His elongated features were expressionless, but his black, pupilless eyes held something deeper, amusement. Callahan stepped into the cell, the door sealing behind him. He studied the alien, his jaw tight, his patience thin. "You know why you're here." The Jarvan's voice was like crushed metal, his translator warping the syllables into something nearly human. "I know that you are desperate." Callahan remained still. "You're going to tell me what your people are planning." The alien exhaled a sound that might have been laughter. "It does not matter. Your resistance is an ember. The Empire is a fire. You are already ash." Callahan's gaze didn't waver. "I've seen your kind bleed." The Jarvan leaned forward, the amusement never leaving his black eyes. "And yet you do not understand. This war is already lost." Callahan's patience snapped. He grabbed the alien by the throat, dragging him forward until their faces were inches apart. "Then why are we still breathing?" The Jarvan tilted his head, unfazed. "Because you have not yet heard the news." Holloway stood just outside the cell, his expression unreadable. "Sir," he said quietly, "we intercepted a transmission. They're preparing another execution. 100,000 this time." Callahan let the alien go, stepping back as the words settled like ice in his veins. His mind raced, calculating the impossible. 72 hours. That was all they had. The Jarvan smirked, his black eyes gleaming. "You cannot stop it." Callahan's fists clenched at his sides. "Watch me." He turned on his heel and strode from the cell, his officers falling in step beside him. The war room was waiting, the weight of the decision pressing down on them all. Jordan spoke first. "Sir, we don't have enough firepower for a full frontal assault." Rivers' voice was sharp. "Then we take what we need." Holloway's gaze darkened. "We can't save them all." Callahan's jaw set. "We save as many as we can, and we make sure the ones responsible don't live long enough to try again." He turned to the display, the Jarvan flagship looming above occupied Earth, the heart of their empire's control. There was only one way to stop the executions, only one way to end this. They had to go straight for the warlord himself. This wasn't just resistance anymore. This was war. The city of New Avalon burned. Fires raged through its streets, casting eerie shadows against the skeletal remains of once proud buildings. The Jarvan occupation, once an unshakable force, was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Explosions punctuated the darkness, each detonation a mark of defiance, a promise that humanity was no longer kneeling. General Joseph Callahan stood on the command balcony of Fort Titan, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where plumes of smoke curled into the night sky. The rebellion had begun in earnest. The power grid was down, surveillance networks shattered, and Jarvan forces were scrambling to regain control. It was chaos. And chaos was precisely what humanity needed. A sharp voice cut through the war room's tense atmosphere. "Sir, we have confirmed engagement zones in Iron Haven, Solaris Prime, and the ruins of Orion's Gate. Resistance forces are mobilizing faster than expected," Major Adrian Jordan reported, his fingers moving swiftly across the holographic map, marking conflict zones in crimson. Callahan's jaw tightened. And the response from the Empire? Colonel Dean Holloway, seated at the far end of the table, exhaled slowly. "As expected, brutal. They've deployed orbital reinforcements. Civilian casualties are already climbing." His expression was impassive, but there was something in his eyes, a weight, an acknowledgement of what they had unleashed. Captain Samuel Rivers leaned against the wall, rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes burning with controlled fury. "Then we hit harder." He straightened, fists clenched. "We took their power, but it's not enough. We need to go for their command centers, their war factories. Turn their own weapons against them." Callahan nodded, his gaze shifting to the battlefield reports streaming in. The Jarvan forces were ruthless, but they were also predictable. The Empire had never dealt with a species like humanity, one that refused to break even in the face of extinction. This war would not be fought in neat formations. It would be waged in the ruins, in the shadows, in the blood-stained streets where humanity had nothing left to lose. The decision was made. The next target was Iron Haven, a city once thriving, now reduced to rubble and occupied by Jarvan war stations. Iron Haven was a strategic stronghold. If they took it, they would cripple the enemy's ability to reinforce their hold on Earth. The plan was simple: strike from multiple angles, overwhelm the enemy, and seize control of the command center. Under the cover of darkness, the first wave of human forces moved in. Soldiers navigated the ruined streets, slipping between collapsed buildings, their movements silent, lethal. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning metal, the remnants of previous skirmishes still smoldering. Rivers led the charge, his unit moving with precision, every step calculated. The Jarvans were formidable, their strength unmatched, but humans had one advantage. They fought with desperation, with fury, with the raw determination of a species refusing to be erased. The first attack came swift and brutal. EMP charges detonated along the perimeter, sending arcs of energy crackling through the air, frying the enemy's targeting systems. Before the Jarvans could react, Rivers and his men were upon them, bullets and plasma fire tearing through the night. The battle was vicious. Jarvan enforcers retaliated with ruthless efficiency, their energy weapons cutting through the darkness in blinding streaks. Rivers dropped into cover behind a twisted wreckage of a transport truck, his breath sharp, adrenaline coursing through his veins. His calm crackled. "Push forward," Jordan ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We have a breach at the eastern sector. Move now." Rivers signaled his squad and surged forward. The fight collapsed into brutal, close-quarters combat. Blades clashed against reinforced armor, the wet sound of bodies hitting the ground lost in the chaos. Rivers took down an enforcer with a precise shot to the throat, pivoting just in time to drive his combat knife into another's exposed joints. The battlefield was a nightmare of smoke and fire, but they were winning. Across the city, Callahan coordinated the larger offensive. Tactical strikes targeted Jarvan reinforcement points, cutting off supply lines, forcing the enemy to retreat deeper into the city. Each skirmish pushed them further back, their once unshakable presence now crumbling beneath the relentless human assault. But the Empire was not without its own fury. An ominous rumble filled the air, deep and unnatural. The ground trembled beneath their feet as massive war machines descended from the sky. Jarvan dreadnoughts, towering behemoths of alien engineering. Their weapons pulsed with devastating energy, capable of leveling entire city blocks in seconds. Holloway's voice came through the command feed urgent. "They're deploying annihilation units. We need to move fast." Callahan's mind raced. They had expected retaliation, but not this quickly. He turned to Jordan. We still have control of the captured artillery. Jordan nodded, eyes alight with realization. We do. Then let's use it. Human engineers had been working tirelessly to repurpose captured Jarvan weaponry, adapting it to their needs. The stolen anti-air turrets had been modified, their targeting systems overridden. With a single command, the repurposed cannons roared to life, spitting streams of energy into the sky. The first dreadnought took a direct hit, its shields flickering before collapsing entirely. A second blast tore through its hull, sending it spiraling downward in a fiery explosion. The others hesitated, momentarily thrown off balance. It was the opening humanity needed. Rivers and his unit pressed forward, cutting down the remaining ground forces. The city belonged to them now. By dawn, Iron Haven was theirs. Callahan stood amidst the ruins, the stench of war thick in the air. Bodies, both human and Jarvan, littered the streets. Smoke curled from the wreckage, but above it all, the first hints of victory glimmered. The Jarvans had never faced an enemy like this, one that adapted, endured, and struck back with ruthless precision. But the war was not over. Holloway approached, his face grim. We intercepted new intelligence. He handed Callahan a data pad. The message was brief, but chilling. The executions have begun. Callahan's grip tightened. His eyes flickered toward the sky, toward the Jarvan flagship looming like a specter over Earth. This battle had been a victory, but it was not enough. The warlord was still out there. The executions were still happening. They had to go higher. They had to take the fight into the heart of the enemy itself. And they would, because humanity did not kneel. The silence of space was deceptive. It stretched infinitely, vast and empty, yet charged with the weight of what was coming. A fleet of stolen Jarvan vessels drifted like shadows against the black void, their hulls repainted, their transponders broadcasting false signals. It was a gambit, a desperate one, but humanity had never won by playing safe. General Joseph Callahan stood aboard the command deck of the captured warship Sovereign Dawn, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carved from steel. The Jarvan flagship, Tyrant's Fist, loomed ahead, a fortress of dark metal suspended in the abyss. It was there that warlord Khazar orchestrated Earth's subjugation, and it was there the executions had begun. Captain Samuel Rivers stood beside him, helmet tucked under his arm, his jaw tight. We breach that ship, or 100,000 more die. There's no other way. Callahan's voice was steady. Then we don't fail. Major Adrian Jordan worked at a nearby console, coordinating the assault. We've mapped out the external defenses. Their shields are weaker than expected, likely compensating for planetary bombardments. If we get close enough, we can punch through with EMP torpedoes. Callahan gave a curt nod. Holloway, are our ground forces in position? The intelligence officer's voice crackled through the comms. Confirmed. Fort Titan is prepared for orbital retaliation if this goes south. It would not go south. Callahan turned back to the viewport, staring at the monstrous form of the enemy flagship. There was no room for hesitation. This was the moment they cut off the head of the snake. The Sovereign Dawn surged forward, engines burning hot. The stolen Jarvan ships followed in tight formation. The ruse lasted mere moments before the Tyrant's Fist recognized the deception. Sirens blared to the enemy fleet as alien warships scrambled to intercept. Then the first EMP torpedo struck. A pulse of electric blue arced across the void, detonating against the Tyrant's Fist shield array. Sparks of failed containment flickered along the hull. The second volley landed, and then the third. The flagship's defenses collapsed in a cascade of broken energy fields. All squads go. Callahan barked. Drop pods launched from the Sovereign Dawn, streaking toward the enemy vessel like falling stars. Rivers braced inside one, his breath steady despite the crushing G-forces. The impact was brutal. The pod's doors burst open, and he was already moving, rifle at the ready. Inside the Tyrant's Fist, the corridors pulsed with crimson emergency lights. Jarvan's soldiers, startled and unprepared for a direct boarding assault, scrambled to mount a defense. But humanity had learned. They were faster now, deadlier. The first wave of Jarvan enforcers fell beneath coordinated gunfire. The second wave was met with precise explosives, shattering defensive barriers. Callahan's squad pushed forward, cutting through opposition with methodical brutality. They fought with desperation, not for survival, but for vengeance, for justice, for the lives stolen by the Empire. The corridors tightened as they neared the command chamber. The final bulkhead loomed before them, thick and unyielding. Rivers planted a charge against it, stepping back as it detonated in a thunderous blast. Beyond the smoke, Warlord Khazar waited. The Jarvan stood tall, his dark exoskeleton gleaming under the dim artificial light. His black eyes burned with something other than fury. Contempt, amusement, a predator indulging a doomed prey. "You've come far," Khazar mused, voice calm despite the chaos echoing through his ship. "But this is where it ends." Callahan stepped forward, his rifle aimed squarely at the warlord's chest. "You're right about that." Khazar moved faster than seemed possible. A blade of pulsing energy ignited in his clawed hand as he lunged. Callahan dodged barely, feeling the heat of the weapon slice through the air where he had stood. Rivers fired, but Khazar twisted, deflecting the shot with inhuman precision. The fight became a blur of motion. Callahan met the Jarvan's attacks with sheer force, dodging, countering, striking whenever an opening appeared. Khazar was stronger, but Callahan had fought wars, had survived battles meant to break men. He refused to fall. Khazar's blade came down in a deadly arc, and Callahan caught the warlord's wrist, forcing the weapon aside. The strain burned through his muscles, but he held, twisting sharply. The blade clattered to the floor. Rivers seized the moment, lunging forward with his combat knife. The steel found its mark, sinking into Khazar's side. The warlord roared, staggering back. Callahan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his sidearm and fired 3 rounds into Khazar's chest. The warlord fell. The silence that followed was deafening. Then the ship trembled. Holloway's voice rang through the comms. "Their fleet's collapsing. They're falling back." Callahan exhaled slowly, stepping over Khazar's lifeless form. "Then it's over." But it wasn't. Not yet. The tyrant's fist shuddered violently, alarms blaring through its corridors. Self-destruct protocols. The Jarvans refused to let their flagship fall into human hands. "Move!" Callahan ordered. They ran, through the wreckage, through the bodies, through the remnants of war. The ship was dying, fire and steel crashing around them. The drop pods were gone. There was no way out, except one. Callahan's gaze shot to the viewport. The Sovereign Dawn hovered just beyond the crumbling hull breach. It was a long shot. River saw it too. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Callahan gave a half-smirk. "On my count," they ran full speed toward the rupture, the vacuum of space howling just beyond. "Now!" Callahan roared. They leapt. For a moment, there was only the weightlessness of the void, the silence of stars. Then the Sovereign Dawn's docking field pulled them in. They collapsed onto the deck, gasping, alive. The tyrant's fist exploded behind them, a fireball swallowed by the abyss. Callahan lay still for a moment, breathing heavily, the enormity of it sinking in. It was over. They had won. The Jarvan fleet was broken, their leader dead, their grip on Earth shattered. Back on the planet, the last of the occupation forces fell under the weight of humanity's fury. Fort Titan's banners flew high. The city still stood. The executions had been stopped. Callahan stood at the viewport, watching the fires of war fade into the endless black. Rivers stepped beside him, his face unreadable. "So what now?" the captain asked. Callahan exhaled, the answer already clear. "Now," he said, "we rebuild." The stars had watched humanity fall. Now, they would watch them rise.